Welcome to the Agents of the Roundtable Wiki Community AMA. Every Monday at 7 p.m. UTC, we discuss Secret Network and its applications with guests from all around the network. This is an audio recording of the AMA. We hope you enjoy.
How's it going, guys?
We're in the wrong Discord, I think.
Yeah, we were. Kim, what's it looking like up where you're at? It is gross as shit outside today here.
It is beautiful and sunny.
Jealous, dude.
It hasn't been that way recently, though.
No, it's been like 90 degrees here for like the past 2 weeks, and we're finally getting some rain. So I guess I should be thankful of it, but still kind of sucks going into work when everything's black and gray outside.
I know. I feel you on that. I sit right next to a window, too. So when it is gloomy out, it just makes the day even harder to get through.
Yeah, I'm just happy that it's light outside. Like the days where I'm going into work when it's dark and it's dark when I leave work, it's like the most depressing shit.
Yeah, I can feel you on that. Especially I guess it's probably the same, but where I live, it can get dark at like 4:50 sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Once you start getting into the fall and winter, yeah, it sucks.
Mm-hmm.
Especially considering I get like very, in a non-sexual way, I get very wet at work. And so if it's cold outside, man, it's like the worst day possible for me. But anyways, got some people pouring in here right now. I think we're just gonna wait for Carter, and then we can kind of get things started. Let's see, is there a meeting chat? Okay, all right, cool. Yeah, they are recording this. Let's see. I'm gonna ping Carter, see if he's popping in. If he's not in here in the next minute or so, we can go ahead and get it going.
Look at these guys.
Oh, Brendan. Very nice of you to show up.
Man, I get so tired of these Monday just meeting. I'm like, I can't do another meeting. I need to eat.
Don't blame you.
Usually Mondays are my easiest day of the week, so this is actually kind of nice for me at least.
Nice.
But yeah, understand like as far as being completely remote, Monday being like everyone's trying to meet, get on the same page for the upcoming week.
Yep.
It makes total sense.
That's why I like that I don't really have a ton of people that I have to talk to in the day, so my Mondays are pretty wide open.
We just hired on a bunch of new employees, and I'm going through training right now. So it's the only thing that kind of puts a damper on my ability to do remote work at the same time. But it is what it is. If anything, these people we just brought on will help me move to being remote even quicker.
There you go.
All right, so I guess we can go ahead and start. If Carter pops in, then that's awesome, and he can just kind of pick up where we're going off. But today we want to do kind of touch on and reflect on what's been going on with Terra UST the past couple weeks, and consequently talk about what has changed regarding the Silk peg model and some of the other changes and takeaways from these past couple weeks, observing what's going on with Luna and UST. So by now, I'm assuming everyone in here is aware of everything that transpired with the crash or collapse of Luna UST. And from Shade Protocol's perspective, a decentralized stablecoin protocol, it's absolutely pertinent for their team to take a hard look at the peg mechanism, as well as any of the other shared similarities between design of Terra and Shade. And that's exactly what the team has done over the past week and a half is really look at what were these shared similarities, what did we inherit from Terra's model design, and what risks are posed by inheriting these design mechanics, and how can we kind of pivot from where we're at. So before we get into like the specs of the various different stablecoin protocols, I feel like it's always a good idea to kind of take a step back and look at stablecoin space as a whole. And this is really important for me, and I guess some newer members, is like, why are stablecoins important? For the first 6 months that I was involved in the crypto space, I knew about stablecoins, but I didn't really care about them because I was interested in volatile assets. I was trying to be risk on, and go with more volatile assets, Atom, Secret, any of your other L1 tokens, or most of your other L1 tokens. But basically, since the turn of the year, I've realized how absolutely important stablecoins are for DeFi growth in general. Kind of like what I said, the vast majority of crypto assets are highly speculative, and their respective values are subject to extreme volatility, especially if macroeconomic conditions don't favor risk on investing. So there are so many reasons that we need stablecoins in DeFi. One of the biggest ones is investors need to have like a safe haven of stability in times of market turmoil. People who were risk on should be able to go risk off without having to necessarily leave the crypto space. And so that's a place where stablecoins fit right in. But then you also have this need to have like fundamental properties of money within the crypto space. And so when I think about the fundamental properties of money, you've got standard of deferred payment. So if you think about in whatever country you live in, most likely your standard of deferred payment is your national currency. I live in the U.S., so standard of deferred payment is U.S. dollars. Money also functions as a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a unit of account. And so stablecoins are able to do all four of those things. So they, for the most part, do have the four fundamental properties of money. And personally, I think I could almost stop right here and say that we could make the argument right here, just saying what the purposes of stablecoins are, how important they are, that the development of stablecoins that have privacy preservation, it is so important. And I'm sure there have been groups before Shade Protocol that have looked at developing a stablecoin on Secret Network, but I am unaware of them. I only got involved with Secret Network probably in September of 2021. So if anything happened before that, I'm pretty unaware of it. But there is an absolute need for privacy preservation in DeFi, and that extends to not only volatile assets like L1 tokens, but also stablecoins. And this kind of blows my mind. Like I see this statement all the time, and so it's almost lost some of its importance to me, or it's like wow factor to me. But traditional finance markets have degrees of privacy to protect end users and to protect these systems, and it kind of blows my mind that the vast majority of DeFi does not have privacy, and for whatever reason, people are okay with that. Maybe they're more concerned with building other things that they feel is important. But in order to really get widespread adoption, mainstream adoption, recognition from like nods from big institutions, VCs, and even as far up as governments. I know the U.S. government has recently came out and said, like, if they were to create a central bank digital currency, it must have privacy preservation to protect end users. And so for me, if I'm hearing my government, and there are other governments that are probably saying these very things, but if governments, with all the data they're trying to collect on their citizens, if governments are even saying, hey, if we're going to use this digital currency, it has to have privacy, that is like a huge flag. Not a red flag, but that's like if the government is saying we need this, then to me, that's like, that says that we really, really need it. Not because the government says so, but that the fact that they also recognize it. So anyways, say all that to say DeFi can and will do better, even if it's Secret Network putting DeFi on its back. I know there are other privacy preserving ecosystems out there that are working on decentralized finance products. And so obviously the growth in privacy finance is going to continue outside of Secret Network, but we do have something really beautiful here within the Cosmos ecosystem, and that's the ability to exchange data and assets amongst sovereign independent blockchains. So, and as far as I know, no other ecosystem can say that. And then you add privacy on top of that, and we're just in a totally different ball field. And in thinking about this, it almost sounds like I'm being an ass when I say this, but when we think about what stablecoins should be, it's right there in the word. You need it to be stable, not short term, over the short term, not over the medium term, but over the long term. And so we need to be able to build, and this is the approach that Shade Protocol is taking. We need to be able to build something that stands up to the most extreme economic and market conditions that are out there. And so that is what the team is doing. They're taking Shade Protocol team is kind of taking a step back, looking at what all these shared similarities are. How can we ensure to the absolute best of our ability that we are going to that we can guarantee that? And so just a little bit of information, background on stablecoins, in case any of you guys haven't had the chance to check out the Terra model, Silk model change video that Carter put out. I highly recommend you doing it. It's like 14 minutes. Ton of information to glean from that. And I've watched that now 4 or 5 different times, and I've taken a lot from that. That's given me information to talk to you guys about today. But one of the big things that I didn't think about, and the Shade Protocol, I guess, didn't think about, was that in order, or maybe it wasn't just in the forefront of their heads, they might have known that this was going on, but they didn't maybe realize all of the implications of it. So basically, in order to issue a liability, there must be assets backing the system to properly account for redemptions of liabilities at large. We've got 4 main types of stablecoins, and if I'm wrong, please someone feel free to pop in here and tell me I'm wrong. But basically, we've got algorithmic stablecoins, which use a burn mint model, and this has no collateral backing other than the coin that you're burning to mint out this stable coin. We've got an example of that would have been Terra, UST. Then we've got collateralized stable coins, and this is kind of a spectrum. You can have partially collateralized, fully collateralized, over collateralized. But a fully collateralized stablecoin would be one-to-one asset backing to whatever liability you're issuing. And then you've got hybrid stablecoins. So this would be like what Frax is, where you have partially algorithmic peg model or pegging mechanism, and then you also have partially collateralized. I would say Shade's initial model was more of a hybrid. They definitely promoted it as an algorithmic
Did we lose him, or is that just him?
Do what?
I think we lost you for a second, or maybe it's just my computer.
Oh no, someone was calling me. Sorry. I was just saying, like Shade, their original model was much more close to a hybrid model where you have this dual burn entry minting mechanism that allowed users to collateralize assets in order to mint out Silk, or they could have burned Shade for Silk, and that would have been the algorithmic stablecoin part. Obviously, things have changed. If you guys haven't read any of the Medium articles or seen any of the videos that Shade has put out, they are switching their model to start out as an over collateralized model, but with modularity that allows flexibility to change some of the redemption and backing mechanisms as we grow, we see how things perform. But within the video that Carter made recently, he mentioned a good way to kind of visualize and almost intellectually critique the safety of liability issuance. And that's really looking at what are your assets divided by your liabilities. And that ratio gives you a degree of stability. So if we looked at Luna UST, the amount of assets backing UST and the amount of in the form of liabilities. I haven't done the math on this, but it's less than 10%, maybe 15% asset to liability ratio, depending on how you weigh in or how much you factor in the market cap of Luna before the collapse started. But basically, as you get to a more over-collateralized model, your asset to liability ratio gets closer to 1. And in an over-collateralized model, you can actually have a degree of stability greater than 1. And that just tells you that you can handle a lot more volatility, let's say extreme conditions, with an over-collateralized model. And I think that's why Shade was decided to kind of move that direction, just because we want to provide something that has legitimate stability, and we have to think about every type of market condition that we could be in over the next 5 to 10 years. And you could even extend it to further than that. But in 5 years, I don't even know what things are going to look like with the modularity that's going to be built into Shade Protocol and Silk. It could look very different in 5 years, depending on how much growth there is, depending on what simulations and R&D is done, what information they glean from that. But with these different degrees of stability, there are some trade-offs. The more collateralized, over collateralized you get, you give up some of your decentralization. If you don't have this modularity built in from the beginning, you lose a sense of reflexivity in how much you can change and react to market conditions. So these are all things that Shade is keeping in mind and should continue to keep in mind as they continue to develop Silk. So just getting more into looking at what the problems were with UST, and a lot of this information is able to be found in the recent Medium articles and videos that Shade Protocol has put out. But there were 3 key aspects or 3 key inherited traits from Terra that Shade Protocol inherited. Those 3 were supply absorption mechanisms, asset backing duality, and open liability issuance. So talk a little bit about supply absorption. So Terra's pegging mechanism was algorithmic in nature. So this basically means that if we look at UST trading above or over peg, if UST was trading above peg, users can burn $1 worth of Luna to mint 1 UST, and then sell that UST on the open market for profit. This reduces the supply of Luna, increases the supply of UST, and pushes the price back down to its intended target. On the flip side, if UST was trading below peg, users could burn 1 UST to redeem $1 worth of Luna, and then they can immediately go sell Luna on the open market for profit. In doing so, we're reducing the supply of UST and increasing the supply of Luna. So the big takeaway was obviously the Terra model systemically struggled to handle a sudden and drastic shift in the demand for UST, and that obviously that can't happen. Macroeconomic conditions are not going to be perfect all the time, and I'm not saying that the developers on Terra modeled this after only positive market conditions. However, to me, this just it highlights the need to really push your simulations and your research to the most extremes, or like to extremes. So in the Terra model, the market cap of Luna was the primary supply absorption for UST. There was after LFG announced that they were going to back, UST with some Bitcoin, that could kind of step in and take on some of the supply absorption for UST. But it's still a really small amount relative to the total outstanding amount of Luna. I think before the crash, there was 18 billion UST. There was 1.5 billion US dollars worth of Bitcoin to absorb the supply of UST. So obviously, it's not a good ratio. And what happened was, and this is my personal biggest takeaway, and I think this is one of Carter's biggest takeaways. I don't want to put any words in his mouth, but markets are really smart, and markets can act really quickly. And in the case of the supply absorption mechanism for Terra, the market reacted way quicker than the supply absorption mechanism could work. Markets were aware of what the mechanism was required, like what was required in order to bring UST back to peg, and that is burning UST into Luna and the supply of Luna becoming inflated. End users knew that was going to happen. Market sell-off of Luna happened, and so the supply expansion mechanism couldn't do its job properly. And to me, this highlights a few things. One, the ability to act extremely quickly, not out of panicking, but being able to react in a calculated way, but react with enough volume and pressure behind it, so to speak. But basically, what was gleaned from that was that this supply absorption method for algorithmic stablecoins works extremely well on average. You could say on average is just like normal market conditions, but in the face of a really sharp decrease in demand that outpaces the depth of liquidity and stability arbitrage, you have a situation where you run into a death spiral, not only for your stabilizer, but also for your stable coin. So obviously that's extremely problematic. Second key takeaway, or second inherited aspect that Shade would have inherited from Terra, was this asset backing duality. And it's a pretty simple concept. It's effectively that with Terra, up until they got Bitcoin, and even once they got Bitcoin, there was a single or two volatile assets that are the primary redemption mechanisms for the stablecoin, without any other assets involved or without any over collateralization. And so what that does is, if you only have two different volatile assets that can that can be used to redeem the value for these stable coins, it's much easier to break the system. It's much easier to attack I don't even really like the word attack, but it's much easier to go after the volatile assets, the few volatile assets that are backing this peg, and try and take those down, whether it be through market manipulation, short positions, whole wide range of things that could be done. But basically, the takeaway from this was that we need to have a diversification in the assets that are backing that are backing our stablecoins. So for Silk, the idea would be to not hold just one or two or three different assets in the Shade Treasury. The idea would be to hold multiple uncorrelated assets, so that way, and this concept applies to investing investing value preservation in multiple different markets and arenas. Diversification definitely helps protect you for the downside. It might limit your growth on the upside, but it protects you on the downside. And then the last big inherited property of the Terra model that Shade would have picked up is this open liability issuance. And this is basically the fact that users are able to issue liabilities in the form of UST, or for Shade Protocol in the form of Silk, at any time. And the protocol is given bad debt whenever your asset that is being burned to mint your stablecoin decreases in price from the point in which you issued that liability. So let's say, you know, Luna was at 50. I wanted to mint out 50 UST, and then the value of Luna drops to 25. Now I've got $50 worth of liabilities issued against $25 worth of assets. Now I'm not in a good degree of stability right there. I've only got half of the assets to back my liabilities, and so the assumption there, or the takeaway from that, was that it's dangerous for any entity other than the protocol to have the ability to issue a liability in the form of a stablecoin. That the protocol will ultimately have to account for via redemption or sale in the future. And so that this last part, open liability issuance, and kind of taking a look at what some of the biggest changes to what Shade will look like from the end user. This is probably the one that that I think of first, was like what's gonna change from a user experience perspective. And so before we go any further, does anyone have any questions or any comments or
Awesome explanation. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. There have been a lot of people who have poured over this data before me that are much smarter than me. And so I think, honestly, what Shade Protocol has done with what Carter's done, and kind of breaking down the economics of why this model didn't work, these are the things we want to do to going forward. Once we get to that point and we kind of realize what the economic problems were, we have the ability to kind of bring in more community voices. Like if there are community members that have hardcore economics backgrounds or data, I'm sure they were also poring over all these things and trying to glean information from this. But I have no economics background. So for me, what I'm really looking to is, who are the people that have this information? What are their points of view? What are their reasons for backing up these points? And then kind of going from there and seeing what we can really do. But so I guess we can talk about some of the other learning moments outside of just these economic things. And I know this is something that we've talked about in Shade Protocol Discord a lot about. One of those is, and this is something that people were calling out long before the collapse of Luna and UST, but subsidizing of liabilities. Right now I'm talking about Anchor. Subsidizing that 20% yield is not in the best interest of the protocol, especially in the case where there is no backing to this subsidized liability issuance. Hold on, give me 1 second, guys.
We want to speak to that.
Leave them. And so this is actually interesting because House of Shade just released a new podcast episode where we actually talked with the Shade lending product, and this was one of the big things we talked about. Subsidizing liabilities and the interest effectively that you're generating by lending assets, and subsidizing these liabilities is obviously not in the best interest of the protocol, and especially not at a rate like 20%. I'm not going to sit here and harp on this. I think anyone who looked at it could tell that this wasn't sustainable. But it's definitely something to take with us as we move forward and we look at building new lending products, new stablecoin protocols, what have you. There were also some other really interesting problems that, as a community member, I didn't realize that these problems could be as big as they ended up being. We saw problems with Oracle price feeds, like Chainlink price feeds, stopping after UST hit a particular value, and any decentralized exchanges or centralized exchanges that were using this Chainlink Oracle price feed were basically quoting people at the wrong price of UST. So that caused people to lose money and or make money they shouldn't have been making. We saw protocols hard coding pegged values of these stable coins, which that part just blows my mind. I don't understand what the idea behind that, but it was done nonetheless. So, and then we also saw the dangers of bridge liquidity and the amount of trust that's placed in your bridge partners, in these centralized exchange partners. Like I was just reading something earlier today, about what I guess is more of a discussion, but like what role, if we're using centralized exchanges as the ability to increase adoption of whatever asset it is, how much trust are we putting in these centralized exchanges? Do we expect these exchanges to halt trading or prevent trading of these assets if they go off peg? Or are they supposed to just let the market kind of run wild? Like what was interesting to me is we saw with Terra, the price of UST was maintained fairly well within the actual Terra ecosystem, but then you go look at these other centralized exchanges or DEXs in other ecosystems, and obviously that's where a lot of the problems with this depeg started. And so just kind of made me take a step back and think about how fast do we really want Silk to grow? How safe is it to really push Silk to be on centralized exchanges? How, and even take a look at what DEXs do we want Silk to be on? How many bridges do we want there to be to get Silk over to these other ecosystems? These are all questions that we kind of have to think about because each one of them has an inherent risk. And that's something that the protocol kind of has to take on in order to reap the benefits of increased adoption and widespread nature of this token. And then something that I'm personally really interested in is what role of on-chain what role does on-chain governance play in trying to help fix this situation? Zen, I know you and I kind of gone back and forth a little bit, talking about, how centralized do you want this decision-making process to be? There are benefits to having centralized, rapid decision-making teams because a lot of times, you can see this with multi-sigs, you can see this with governance props. Like voting generally takes a while, and especially if you want to get to quorum or be able to include a large portion of your actual community, it takes a while to get people to vote. And in the case of we have less than 24 hours to potentially fix something, you might not have time for that. And so we've talked about a few different ways, and I'm not going to go into all these different details right now, but there are a few different methods we could go about, approaching this, whether it's using representatives, like these unpaid individuals. There's no economic incentive for them to vote a particular way. Being able to use representatives to that it's creating a slightly centralized group of decision makers, but they're all voted in by the community. So and the community could vote themselves instead of having the representative vote. They would just have to vote within that short time frame. And then you add Shade Protocol governance is going to be super fucking cool. That's one of the things I'm actually looking forward to most. But you add all these different assemblies, the Silk strategic assembly, tactical assembly. You add representatives, branches, committees that can all come together and help advise and discuss what needs to happen going forward. And so those are just all large-scale observations about what happened during these past few weeks. And then from that, we can kind of start talking about what are the actual changes to the Silk model. And I'm going to go ahead and assume that none of these changes are set in stone. I'm sure there's a lot of things still moving around because it's only been so much time. There's only so many simulations and so much research you can do within that short period of time. So I would say most of the changes that have been proposed, they're not hard-coded or they're not 100% determined, but there's probably some really, really good arguments to be made for why these changes are made. So the biggest one, obviously, is Silk is no longer going to be primarily an algorithmic stablecoin. Upon launch, the team is planning on launching it as an over-collateralized stablecoin built with modularity that allows for the integration of future redemption, stability, issuance mechanisms. And before they consider integrating any of these other mechanisms, obviously there's going to have to be a ton of simulation modeling of Silk to go on. And I know the team is currently building new. They're currently simulating and building new software and developing software to test and simulate Silk in all of these extreme market conditions. And what this modularity really does is it just gives Silk the ability, the flexibility to evolve over time as we glean information from these different simulations. And one of the other big things kind of tied in with that over collateralization required to mint out the stablecoin is that individuals will only be able to mint Silk by collateralizing assets. Individuals will no longer be able to mint Silk from Shade. The only group that can mint Silk from Shade will be the protocol, because the protocol is the one who at the end of the day has to answer for all these liabilities. So starting off, and it kind of makes sense to keep this, in my opinion, maybe not so hardcore about it, but for the most part, keep it so that the protocol is the main group issuing liabilities. And I've talked to Carter about a few different things that the protocol would consider minting Silk for against its own market cap, and there's some really interesting things developing on this front. I'm not going to speak on this just because I know a lot of things are still being developed. A lot of testing still has to be done, but there will still be Shade burned for Silk. It's just gonna the things that basically are given the okay to do that for are gonna be subject to change. And then on the flip side of that, the burning Silk for Shade will stay exactly the same. So it's still got that supply absorption method that works super well in normal market conditions. You still have the ability to resolve peg disparities by burning Silk into Shade. And so after thinking about this, those are the main changes to the Silk peg model. I guess before I get into how this impacts value accrual mechanisms, does anyone have any questions or comments or want to discuss anything?
On the governance side, I think we should give trust to the builders while they build it, ultimately.
Yep. I definitely agree with you there. I would say especially early on, builders are going to be the ones that understand the protocol most intimately. And so while I think that community members can provide some really good sentiment and good ethical arguments for doing things a particular way, but when we're looking at what argument we should favor more, something that favors security and stability versus like fitting our ethical where we want to be ethically within this protocol during these extreme times, that's a really tough decision to make. As a decentralized stablecoin protocol, we want to be as decentralized as possible. But with that decentralization, decentralization comes risks, and in all sorts of forms. I agree with you. I think the builder should definitely have a large say. And if I'm not mistaken, in looking at the way governance for Shade Protocol is set up, a lot of the different branches have the ability to kind of not particularly vote, but have input on certain changes. Like, I haven't seen anything. No, I could be wrong, and feel free to point it out to me if I am wrong. But all the decisions that are made within Shade Protocol for whatever branch or committee, there are other people weighing in on that as well. It's never just, 4 or 5 people that are making decisions. Sorry, I got people still calling me. It's never going to be just a few people making decisions. I guess if we take these changes to Silk model into consideration, we will come to the conclusion that there are the value accrual mechanisms for the protocol and Shade token consequently are impacted. And I'm just gonna kind of put some statements out there and pose some questions. I don't have answers for these. These are things that we need to think about, that the team needs to think about. But depending on how the protocol manages the treasury, and by that I mean how much of the volatile assets that are collateralized to mint Silk, what percentage of those volatile assets will remain on the balance sheet versus those that are swapped for some sort of centralized or collateralized stable. Depending on how those assets are managed, we're going to see a change in staking rewards distributed to Shade stakers. So one of the nice value accrual mechanisms for Shade stakers in the future is that assets that are collateralized by individuals wanting to mint out Shade or Silk, those can be staked or LP'd, and then the rewards generated from that get redistributed to Shade stakers. So in the event that I'll just use the example that Carter posed in his video, if 80% of the collateral that is accepted by the Treasury to mint out Silk is swapped for some sort of centralized stable, in effect, we're removing 80% of the potential staking rewards that we can get. Now, I'm not saying that I'm not saying that the 80% value is set in stone. This was a number that was put out by Carter during this video a few weeks ago, so things very much could have changed. But this has my mind thinking, what, depending on how things change, I can look at this, I can kind of create this spectrum of where I think value accrual mechanisms will be impacted and what that will look like. So that's one thing, Treasury L1 staking rewards. That's going to vary depending on how the Treasury manages its assets. What assets will the Treasury want to allow users to collateralize? Maybe they allow them to, and again, this is just me putting a question out into the world. This is not me saying any. This is going to be what it is, but like the protocol might allow people to collateralize anything, or maybe like a really wide spectrum, but then, like I mentioned earlier, 80% of that gets swapped for some sort of centralized or collateralized stablecoin, and then the protocol decides to keep 20% of those assets in the form of assets that they feel safest holding. It could be that the protocol is going to be really, really picky with what assets they allow users to collateralize. In which case, both of those are going to kind of impact Silk's growth and the amount of revenue generated from Silk's adoption and usage. And I just want to go ahead and say this, while value accrual mechanisms may be impacted, it is done purely from a place of security and stability. You know, it doesn't do us any good to have super high staking rewards if this protocol is only going to be around for 6 months because everything blew up. So being pickier with what assets you allow to be collateralized, what you do with those assets, I know we should be taking a really hard look at this. And then another thing that that will impact value accrual for the Shade token and the protocol in general is what sort of activity do we see the Treasury having in various different aspects of DeFi? You know, how much of the assets backing liabilities are we willing to actively be using rather than having ready to go to absorb silk supply? So how much is the protocol going to be LPing? Because Treasury LP rewards is part of the Shade Stake, the revenue that gets redistributed to Shade stakers. How much is the protocol going to be engaging in arbitrage? How much is the protocol going to be participating in the lending market? You know, these are questions that we can ask ourselves and we can discuss with the team. And after we get some answers, I don't have any answers right now. But once we get those, we can start coming to some better conclusions about how quickly growth will happen, or how quickly we estimate growth to happen, and kind of where we see everything looking long term. And I'm not saying this to try and be a downer. None of the changes to Shade and Silk's model has me any less bullish on Shade and Silk. If anything, this makes me feel more bullish about how long Shade Protocol stands to be in this space.
Yeah, I think stability is huge there. I think kind of like you're alluding to, is that this is only making, in my eyes, the protocol more sustainable. And that's should be the goal right now for anyone building any sort of collateralized pegged asset, in my eyes.
Mm-hmm. And it's hard, and I don't know if this is a result of communities like echo chambers being formed, people being super impatient with trying to make money. Obviously, everyone wants token price to go up, unless you're just a perma bear and you want everything to fail and you'll make money on the way down. But most people want their bags to appreciate. But we need to be realistic from a community member standpoint. We need to be realistic in what we expect the team to take on, the amount of risk that we expect the team to take on, and in a sense, how much risk are we willing to take on by holding these assets if we know that we're not doing the safest things with the protocol. So personally, the growth of Silk is probably going to be slower because users are going to have to collateralize assets in order to mint out Silk. However, it will be a more realistic and real value of how much money effectively has been put into the protocol to mint out Silk. Like, it'll be a better representation of what value is actually in Silk and within the protocol. So the thing that I've been racking my brain around are these questions posed by Carter and the team at the end of his the Terra model review video. And he posed 7 questions. I don't have answers for all of them, but I have been thinking about answers to a few of them. First question, and I would love feedback from you guys. I know we're coming up on an hour, but this is the last thing I really wanted to talk about, was these big questions that were posed by the team and by Carter. First one is, what is considered a quality asset? We kind of talked about that a little bit, or I kind of talked about that a little bit earlier, but like thinking about what is considered a quality asset, what is the protocol okay holding on their balance sheet in order, like, as the asset backing liability that will be Silk that gets minted out, And in order to think about what is this quality asset, what metrics are we using? Or are we using, there's a litany of different metrics we could use. And quality is very subjective. You ask different people, what is a quality asset? If you're a Bitcoin maxi, your definition of quality digital asset is going to be different than. Go ahead.
Are you talking about yield bearing or stable assets?
Both of them are going to end up being held on the Treasury's balance sheet. So, we have to think about it from both points. What is considered a quality stablecoin that we would consider holding on our balance sheet as asset backing for liabilities? What sort of volatile assets are we willing to hold on our balance sheet? And what sort of metrics are we comparing assets against each other to make these decisions? And so I know S-Beam, the lead developer of Shade Lend, a few days ago, he was talking about the what is considered quality assets. What are the risks associated with various different assets? And in the conversation he was having, it was surrounding stables. And so he basically put it like this: you've got tail risk on both extreme sides of your stable coins. You've got highly centralized and highly decentralized stables. If you use a centralized asset, you introduce the risk of government action, right? That's one of the big reasons that Shade wants to not use a USD pegged stablecoin. Is you're in a sense issuing a derivative of this sovereign currency that the U.S. federal government could take problem with very soon in the future potentially. And if we're using, go ahead.
I was going to say, especially if you're not collateralizing your stable with USD. So, for example, if you're going to have a USD coin and you're not actually using USD to back it, you can see where the Fed Reserve might, or I guess the U.S. government might say, hey, you're basically just printing fake US dollars because you're not backing them up with our own US dollars. Mm-hmm. So to them, they can see that as a very, essentially a competitor. And that's not something the US government will likely deal with. So to your point, I think it is very important that, or very smart of Shade to kind of avoid that regulatory risk by not pegging to a sovereign currency that is governed by one of the most powerful governments in the world.
But even then, I agree with you. But even taking into account what you're saying, let's say you do collateralize it with USD. If your protocol gets big enough, you might have control over a sizable portion of this circulating sovereign currency, which then the government's going to have a problem with that because now you can have influence over monetary policy, which obviously is not good at all from the government standpoint.
Especially when they can't control it, right? Like with current institutions and banks, that's kind of how it works. But they have a lot of control. So they control interest rates and other levers they can pull to kind of, manipulate supply and the value. So it is interesting that as it becomes more decentralized, it becomes a bigger threat to the government because they can no longer really control what you do. Unless you can get a group of people in a government to all agree that what the protocol wants to do is aligned with what the government wants you to do. And that's probably not going to happen.
I was about to say, it's probably not going to happen. So on the other tail risk you have, so we were talking about centralized stables. The other extreme side, you have a extremely decentralized stable. You introduce the risk of that stable becoming insolvent. And so in both of those cases, the protocol is hurt. But we have to think about what is more likely to happen. Is it more likely that the government's going to step in and say, hey, we've got a problem with you using this, let's say use USD as an example. We have a problem with you using pegging your stablecoin to USD. We have a problem with you collateralizing all these digital assets with actual US dollars. We're going to freeze your assets or we're going to go after you. I don't know what that would look like from a legal standpoint, but I'm sure the government has a full playbook of ways that they could go after entities. And so, in thinking about what's more likely, government's going after these centralized stables or a decentralized stable becoming insolvent, I think based on what recent history has shown us is that it's much more likely that a decentralized stable becomes insolvent. Now, that's not to say that we should rely specifically on centralized stablecoins. I mean, personally, I would love it if we could go completely away from that. But I know that there is real value right now in holding centralized stables. I mean, hell, that's what damn near all of my cash is sitting in right now is centralized stables. I might not like it, but it works really well. And so, and then thinking about these volatile assets that the Treasury might be holding, do we favor particular L1 tokens or application tokens over others? You know, Shade developed on Secret Network for a very particular reason. You know, they wanted this programmable privacy for not only Shade and Silk, but all the interactions with their DeFi products. How does Shade treat Secret that's collateralized? From the perspective of someone who's holding Secret, I would love it if the protocol didn't dump Secret, swap Secret for these other stables, and didn't continually put sell side pressure on the Secret Network token. But we're talking about security of the protocol here. There's a lot of other ways to for Secret to appreciate in price, and I don't know how much emphasis we need to, or how much the price of Secret we have to take into account, or the price of any of these other L1s that we are holding on our balance sheet, how much we have to take into account their price movement relative to the stability we get by swapping those for stables. These are all open-ended questions that we all as community members within Shade ecosystem or any stablecoin ecosystem that you might be a part of, these are things you need to think about.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's critical right there is, how much risk can you have on your balance sheet in terms of volatility, right? Even if you keep it at a very minor level, like you're saying, let's say only 20%, just arbitrary, but let's say 20% is in volatile assets, you're still taking a pretty large risk there because there's already inherent risk with stables. And so now you're adding an additional layer of instability with volatility. So it is really interesting to see what models people come up with that can kind of still give you maybe a little bit of upside with having assets on your balance sheet that can generate good yield or could appreciate in price. But at the same time, is that even necessary? Are protocols thinking too much about upside and not enough about stability? And I think that is a question that we kind of, as a community, need to hone in on and decide, is that something we even care about? Do we really need volatile assets that are generating yield on the balance sheet, or could we generate revenue from other sources that's more sustainable and doesn't put the overall protocol at risk or the balance sheet? So these are questions that I don't really have the answer to either, but stuff that I've been thinking about and trying to develop some sort of strategy to kind of, or at least not even strategy, to come to terms with what I think makes the most sense. And to be honest, I'm more towards almost having nothing on the balance sheet that's volatile, and focusing more on long-term sustainability and ideally even small, maybe 2 to 3% yield off of stable coins, similar to what you get at a traditional bank.
Yeah, it is. That's a really good point. I mean, if you think about what's the most, I'm using stable in a relative sense here, but like what is the most stable volatile asset out there? I think most people think of Bitcoin or maybe Ethereum. And even that is still super volatile. I mean, look at the past month and a half. The price action, or even go back as far as the beginning of this year. Look at the price action that's happened. It's not stable. It might be more stable. It might have, gone down less than other volatile assets, but that does not mean it's stable by any means. So I think what you're saying, Kim, that is something we really have to look at. How much do we prioritize this price appreciation, this reward generation over stability? And this might actually be one of the most critical questions that we can ask, because right now in DeFi, you look at DEXs, lending products, anywhere else you can go find yield. People are chasing yield. As soon as you get better yield somewhere else, a lot of times, people are going to take their assets, move it to a new place, and farm yield there.
Yeah, that's that whole mercenary capital kind of
Mhm.
idea. They're going to go where they're going to get the best reward. And I guess on top of that, you almost have to decide again, like what are you confident in the long term? And that's something that's so hard because, like you said, you can look at Bitcoin and Ethereum, but they're still pretty volatile. And then even if you compare it to the US dollar, which has obviously is stable but is subject to inflation based on the prices of everything around it changing. When you look at the US dollar, 7% inflation, 8% inflation, let's say, that's nothing compared to the volatility you've seen in some of these other assets like
Yeah.
Bitcoin and Ethereum. So even if you were to go a different route and let's say use commodities, I know a lot of people are working on getting commodities on chain in some form, and you could go that route. But again, those are also subject to volatility, maybe
And you
less
need to look
volatile.
at liquidity too. How much liquidity is there? Like, can we unload our balance sheet if we need to? And will the unloading of our balance sheet cause massive price changes?
I mean, yeah, no, that's a very important thing that I think a lot of people don't consider is that a protocol fully diluted, or sorry, I guess FDV, basically their full market cap is not necessarily what they could get out in cash because there's
Yeah.
almost never enough liquidity to be able to pull
exactly.
out of the market. So that is a very relevant question that you have to understand is if you are backing a stable or really have anything on a balance sheet that is based like that, it needs to be able to, I don't know. I guess.
Yeah, I mean, you got to look at daily. Like when I was looking at, how much price impact would Terra or LFG selling Bitcoin impact Bitcoin's price. So you can look at what's the daily volume of Bitcoin trading, and I think at the time it was like 60 billion, right? There was only 1.5 billion USD value in Bitcoin that LFG held, so there is enough liquidity for them to sell all that or swap all of that if they needed to. But if we're talking about holding commodities, your entire commodity, like let's just use Comdex just because they're the one that popped into the front of my head, like synthetics market for commodities. If they've only got 25, 30 million in liquidity for particular assets, you might only be able to unload small portions of these commodities without moving price. And if the stable coin that is being backed by these is dropping in price, you need to be able to unload and react super quick. So another thing that I was thinking about is, or that Carter mentioned, was what is an acceptable asset to liability ratio, and how do we manage that? And this kind of goes back to how much are we going to keep in stables and within the treasury? How much are we going to keep in stables? How much are we going to hold in volatile assets? And for those stable assets that you're holding, how much of those are going to be bridged assets? That's something else we have to take into account. If we're holding the majority of our stable assets within the treasury in bridge tokens, in my eyes, that's an additional attack surface that we're exposing ourselves to. If the bridge is exploited or attacked, our treasury balance could be at risk. So, does that mean we have to look at only, IBC enabled stablecoins offer? Does that mean we have to be super, like, just ultra critical of the bridge partners that we utilize? Again, these are all questions. I'm not an expert on bridges, but these are the things that we should be thinking about. Another question is, when is it okay for the protocol to issue liabilities against itself? I mentioned Carter and I have talked previously, and they've already got a few ideas for where the protocol could see itself issuing liabilities in the form of Silk against Shade's own market cap. But this is a bigger question, probably more just for the team, because they're the ones that are taking on the liability ultimately. But I guess if Shade is to be truly decentralized, we as Shade holders and Shade stakers are a part of this protocol. So we also have to think about, what would I be okay issuing liabilities against my own assets? Like, what would I be okay with doing that for? And when people think about it with their own bags, that's usually when people get a lot more risk off. It's like, probably not a whole lot. And, and thinking about this just requires you to be objective, kind of put your, walk in someone else's shoes for a little bit. Another one is like, what is this modeling going to look like? What is the simulation going to look like? I don't know. I know that the Shade Lend team, the core protocol team, they're all working on these things, building new simulation systems to be able to test all this stuff. And then kind of associated with some of the other questions that were posed, like, how does the protocol handle buybacks? We want to diversify the assets within the treasury to prevent any sort of easy attack surfaces in the form of short positions against collateralized assets. So if we're only holding Bitcoin on our balance sheet that's backing Silk, someone could semi-easily try and manipulate the market for Bitcoin or short it in conjunction with bad market macro conditions, and try and get Silk off peg. So how do we handle that diversification? How does the protocol go about swapping assets for each other? And then kind of related to what I was talking about, what is the acceptable asset to liability ratio, and holding these bridged assets? Like, how do we handle a multi-chain Silk? And this is probably something to think about for, 8 months to a year down the road, when we're looking at potentially getting Silk into other ecosystems. What does that look like? As soon as we take Silk out of Secret Network or out of the Cosmos ecosystem, we are introducing some risk into the system. Because now we're not really playing by our own rules anymore. We're playing by someone else's rules, in a sense. And we're relying and trusting on other people to be able to implement our rules to the best of their ability. Anyways, the big takeaway for me after looking at this whole situation is that Shade Protocol is taking the right steps to make sure that all of the inherited similarities between Terra model and the Shade model are fixed, and they're accounted for. The risk there is noted and mitigated. But then also really trying to think critically about what are these changes to our model? How does that change the runway for Silk? Not saying it's got any short of a runway. If anything, it might have a longer runway, that it's a smaller slope, so to speak. Like, it's a more gradual climb. So I'm curious to hear what any of you guys, if you want to speak up or pose any questions or discuss anything that was kind of talked about. I'm interested to hear what you guys think about some of the initial proposed changes to Shade and Silk's model, and some of these questions that we have to kind of think about from a community standpoint.
Really like your suggestion, Crypto Chem, about prioritizing stability against yield-bearing assets. I would back that vote any day.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I think it's important because I don't think a lot of people want to do what's right for the protocol. So their first thought is, how do we create revenue, or how do we create value for this protocol? And the first idea is, oh, let's generate yield. On paper, that sounds great, but if you're generating yield while token value is going down, that might not be making up for the value lost. So even though you are generating yield, it could actually be still a detriment to your overall protocol. So I think what people have good intentions when they suggest these strategies, but I think the point of anything that's collateralized, it needs to be stable in the sense that the collateral behind it is stable. So I think we need to really kind of shift our view of what a backing is and then go from there. So like Red said, focusing on stables is one part, but then what stables? And then if you do want to get away from a stable coin, as in like the US dollar stable coins, where do you go next where you still feel comfortable that the volatility will be very minimal? I hear a lot of people talk about taking like delta neutral positions, but now you have to have an active treasury that's being managed. So how does that work?
Yep.
So there's solutions to some of these problems, but then it adds a few more layers of kind of convolution where it's now what, do we get a team of people working on the treasury?
About to say, you're centralizing the management of your treasury then in a lot of ways.
But
if you do that, if you have this active management,
right, and that's an inherent issue. But I think you almost need to do that because you can't, like you mentioned earlier, you can't really risk leaving up to like governance, because the speed in which governance can make decisions is not fast enough, especially if you're trying to delta neutral hedge.
It's experimental.
Yeah,
exactly. Yep.
And one of the
no, go ahead.
I was gonna say one of the things that I keep racking my brain about, and I don't think we're gonna get to see this play out with Shade, just because it's too much of a risk to really see how it plays out. But I'm of the opinion that privacy, like true privacy within DeFi, will solve a lot of the problems that occurred with Luna and UST. I don't know how many of them can be solved and to what degree it can be solved, but I know that certain things that would give traders clarity about how successful a particular short position may be, or how successful a particular set of trades may be. If there's no on-chain data that they can query about liquidation prices, if they can, let's say Shade wanted to keep all their assets wrapped in privacy. Now individuals are going to have a hard time figuring out what assets, like in the event that someone wanted to take down Shade or Silk, they're going to have a hard time figuring out what assets they want to short or try and attack to reduce the power of these collateralized assets. So I don't think we're ever going to see someone taking on. Well, maybe they do, but I'm of the opinion that privacy is such a powerful tool in DeFi that a lot of the problems that I think we would have inherited from Terra would be mitigated fairly successfully.
I agree that it's a powerful tool, but I disagree that it would deflect that attack, because all you need is more money than the backing of the asset. That's it. I mean,
and I think
even if there's not a talk of an attack, like even let's say that Silk over time has pushed out, let's say, $300 billion US, just calling a number here. Mm-hmm. And for whatever reason, the crypto market crashes and suddenly there's only 120 million on the balance sheet. There's not an attack at that moment, but still you're insolvent. So the problems that Terra faces, or faced, I should say, is not only from an attack factor, it's just also normal market economics that the protocol needs to protect itself from.
I think to Red's point, I think privacy would have, provided some stopgaps, or at least made it a lot more difficult to do what happened to Terra. But I also do agree that it was Terra's overall, I guess, strategy and mechanism that was flawed in the sense that, one, they tried to back it with Bitcoin, and two,
I'm not here saying that Terra would have been saved by privacy. That's not what I'm saying.
I agree with you on that. Certainly would have made it harder, and it might have even made it a slower process before they ultimately depegged, which would only, in my eyes, just get more people involved. So, I mean, that's just kind of a side thought, but I agree with what you guys are saying. We definitely don't think that privacy solves all the issues. It might solve one piece of it, and that's why my talk has been mainly focused on what do we need to change in Shade and Silk overall to make sure that it's sustainable. Like what needs to change in the grand scheme of stables to make these more useful and trustworthy.
And to the credit of the Shade Lend team, they had been working on this over collateralized Silk model for, I think Carter said 5 months or so now. So they've already got a real nice head start on this model. I'm super interested to hear what sort of information they drop in Austin. I'm not sure how many of you guys within this chat are going to be at Austin, but I know almost everything there is going to be live streamed and or available in video form afterwards. And so I know Shade has many times said that there's going to be a ton of alpha, a lot of information dropped in Austin. And I'm sure information regarding the Silk Peg, Shade Lend, a few other primitives they've talked about kind of demoing and I guess making public to the world are going to be unveiled in Austin. So it's going to be a really good chance to chat with them a little bit more intimately and in depth about, you know, the answers to some of these questions we've been talking about here, and what they think is the right path going forward.
So excited
Yeah,
for the live stream.
It's gonna be good stuff. I think. Does anyone else have any questions or want to discuss anything? Otherwise, we're probably going to be wrapping it up here pretty soon. All right, guys. Thank you all for joining in. Just a little plug for some more information about Shade. Kim and I both run the House of Shade podcast, and we just published a new episode today featuring S-Beam, the lead developer and economist for the Shade Lend product. And so we talked a lot about product mechanisms. We talked about, we talked about the liquidations market, the interaction of the protocol with these different primitives, where Shade is in the DeFi space, give overarching kind of review and analysis over lending products in general. So if you're interested in learning any more about, what an over collateralized product will look like and what the interactions with that will look like, I highly suggest you go check that out. You can find it on YouTube. Just look up House of Shade. It's going to be our most recent episode. Yeah. So, Kim, you got anything to add before we close up?
I'm going to post the House of Shade video in the meetings chat.
Okay.
But then also just in general, I guess the way I'd close it down is just that I think the community, Shade in general is very open to community feedback. They want to hear other ideas. We have a lot of people in the background, really thinking through these things and talking through them in depth, but we're always willing to hear more and get more feedback from the community, because we know there's a ton of people who have a lot of skills and a lot of knowledge that just kind of sit back and listen, and that's totally fine. But if you do have anything you can add, we're more than willing to listen and incorporate it into the protocol if it's something that will, at the end of the day, make it stronger and more sustainable.
Yeah. And just there are a few really active Shade Protocol community members in here. I'm Crown, Mindtrap, Rockin' Ape, Senyar, Zenopi. You guys crush it in the Discord and in the Telegram. We seriously love all the interactions and suggestions. You guys are, and anyone else that I didn't mention, that is engaging with Shade Protocol community. Like, seriously, we want and need your community interaction. Like, we're going to be super receptive to any ideas, even if we don't end up implementing them. It's important that we consider all different aspects and viewpoints. So having you guys engaged and interacting with the protocol is super helpful, and I'm really happy you guys joined us today to talk a little bit about what's changing with Shade and what we can kind of expect to look for in the future.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah. All right. See you guys. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for listening in on the Agents of the Roundtable Community AMA. Follow us on Twitter at secret_AOTRT and every Monday at 7 p.m. UTC in the Secret Network Discord.